Castles were never built to keep enemies out, they were built to trap people inside, because the moment the gates slammed shut a castle stopped being a home and became a sealed survival machine where food, water, fear and time turned into weapons sharper than any sword. And this is the paradox historians can't stop circling around. The higher the walls rose, the more fragile life behind them became. Because a castle expected the worst day imaginable to arrive sooner or later, not with banners and trumpets but at dawn, when smoke crawled across the fields and farmers ran toward the gates carrying children, sacks of grain and animals dragged by ropes, while the horizon slowly filled with metal and movement. And the first line of defense was never the wall but distance. Castles were planted where armies already struggled, on volcanic rock like Edinburgh Castle where attackers had to climb a brutal stone slope before battle even began, on cliffs that shattered formations, above rivers that slowed supply wagons, on jagged hills where ladders slipped and siege towers tilted, so if you were attacking you started losing long before you reached the gate. Your boots sank into mud, your shoulders burned hauling armor uphill, and all the while defenders watched from above calculating angles because height turned gravity into a loyal soldier that never slept. Then came the moat, not always filled with water but always filled with a problem, wide enough to stop towers, deep enough to break ankles, sometimes lined with stakes, sometimes dry and silent. And at places like Bodiam Castle the water barrier forced armies to expose themselves while building bridges under fire. Moats prevented tunneling, slowed charges and funneled attackers into narrow crossing points where arrows could stack bodies faster than they could be dragged away. And only then did you meet the walls. Not just tall stone surfaces but layered shock absorbers built like giant stone sandwiches, two stone faces packed with rubble cores that swallowed impact instead of shattering, some walls so thick battering rams felt like toys, sloped bases deflecting force upward, every failed siege in history whispering into the blueprint of the next fortress. But the real nightmare wasn't the wall, it was the gatehouse, the most misunderstood structure in medieval warfare. Not a door but a trap system, a tunnel of death designed to turn confidence into panic. Drawbridge, heavy doors, then a portcullis, an iron grid that could drop in a heartbeat. Many gatehouses had two, attackers rushing forward suddenly trapped in a stone throat crushed between barriers, packed so tightly they couldn't lift shields, while murder holes above opened like silent mouths. Stones, arrows, boiling water, burning sand, oxygen thinning, screams multiplying, and if they somehow broke through the outer door they still weren't inside. They were in a killing corridor where every step forward cost blood and time was the one resource castles were built to hoard. Long before swords ever touched stone, the real battle for a castle was fought in the mind, because fear traveled faster than any army and defenders weaponized that fear with brutal precision, starting with visibility, since castles were designed to be seen from miles away, not just as buildings but as warnings carved into the landscape, silhouettes on hilltops that told every traveler, merchant and scout the same message: you will not surprise us. And that mattered because surprise was an attacker's greatest ally. So castles stripped it away, replacing uncertainty with dread, and when an army finally appeared, defenders did not rush to fight, they performed calm, deliberate rituals meant to be watched. Gates closed slowly, banners raised higher, livestock brought inside, archers walking the walls in full view signaling preparation instead of panic, and that quiet confidence planted the first seed of doubt, because a fortress that looks ready is harder to charge than one that looks afraid. Then came the waiting game, the most underestimated weapon in medieval defense, because castles were engineered around the idea that time itself could be sharpened into a blade. Wells dug deep into bedrock meant water could not be poisoned or cut off. Underground storage packed with dried grain, salted meat and ale designed to last months, sometimes years, while attackers outside had to feed thousands of men and horses from land already stripped bare. And every day the siege dragged on flipped the balance of power. Hunger attacked morale faster than arrows pierced armor, discipline rotted, desertions began, disease spread through cramped camps where sanitation collapsed, and suddenly the army that came to conquer found itself trapped in its own slow disaster. While inside the walls life shrank but continued, routines maintained not for comfort but for stability, prayers at fixed hours, watch rotation strict and visible, repairs constant, because structure killed panic. And defenders understood something modern audiences forget: most sieges ended not with walls falling but with one side giving up, negotiating or retreating, and castles were built specifically to make the attacker reach that breaking point first. But when patience failed and assaults began, the architecture itself shifted, the rules of physics, because because walls were not vertical surfaces to climb, they were angled curved layered systems that broke ladders, deflected stones and forced attackers into choke points where numbers stopped mattering. Towers were positioned so no section of wall could be approached without being hit from multiple angles, crossfire turning open ground into invisible traps, while machicolations allowed defenders to drop projectiles straight down where shields were useless. And here the castle revealed a cruel truth: defense favored gravity. A rock falling required no training, no strength, only height, and castles had endless height, and if attackers brought siege engines, defenders answered with geometry. Walls built thick with rubble cores that absorbed impacts instead of shattering surfaces sloped to glance off projectiles, defenders targeting enemy machines first because destroying the tools of war crushed morale faster than killing soldiers. And then there was sound, the overlooked weapon, because castles amplified it, horns echoing across courtyards, drums signaling shifts, shouted commands bouncing off stone, creating the illusion of more defenders than actually existed, while attackers outside heard chaos without understanding it, and confusion breeds hesitation, and hesitation on a battlefield is lethal. And beneath all of this lay the deeper truth: castles were not passive structures, they were active defense systems designed to manipulate emotion as much as movement, to stretch time, bend terrain and turn confidence into exhaustion. And every day a banner still flew above those walls, it whispered the same message to the army outside: you are the one being worn down, you are the one running out of strength, and the longer you stay the weaker you become. If walls were the body of a castle, then towers were its eyes and claws, and they changed medieval warfare from a flat contest of numbers into a three-dimensional nightmare where defenders did not just block an army, they surrounded it without ever leaving the safety of stone, because towers projected power outward, letting archers fire not only straight ahead but along the faces of the walls themselves, a design called flanking fire that turned every approach into a cross-angled trap where shields became useless and ladders turned into vertical coffins of hesitation. And attackers learned the hard way that reaching the wall did not mean safety, it meant entering a zone where every step forward exposed a side, a back or an unprotected angle. And this is where geometry replaced heroism, because castles were laid out so that blind spots barely existed, each tower positioned like a chess piece covering the weaknesses of another, overlapping fields of fire creating invisible grids of danger across the landscape. And the higher you climbed toward the walls, the worse your odds became, because defenders above could shoot down with greater force and accuracy, while attackers had to fight gravity, exhaustion and the simple terror of looking down and realizing retreat was harder than advance. And towers were not hollow lookout posts but compact fortresses stacked vertically, each level designed for a different phase of defense: lower floors storing weapons and stones, middle levels housing archers, protected by narrow arrow loops that widened inward so defenders could adjust angles without exposing themselves, and upper platforms built for visibility, signaling and long-range fire, turning the tower into a command node that fed information across the castle through flags, horns and runners, because information traveled faster from height, and in siege warfare knowing where the enemy moved often mattered more than how many soldiers you had. And this created a psychological distortion where attackers felt constantly observed, every movement tracked, every engine positioned under watchful eyes, while defenders moved with the confidence of overview, reacting instead of guessing. And then came the brutal elegance of spiral staircases inside towers, a detail so small most people miss its purpose, built to turn clockwise as they rose so that a right-handed defender coming down had room to swing a weapon, while an attacker climbing up found their sword arm cramped against the central pillar, reducing power, range and balance in the tightest, most exhausting part of the fight. And that single architectural twist transformed a staircase into a force multiplier, where one defender could delay many attackers simply because stone controlled movement better than courage ever could. And if attackers managed to capture a tower, the advantage did not fully flip, because inner walls and higher positions still overlooked it, meaning the castle was layered like an onion of resistance, where taking one point rarely unlocked the next. And this reveals the deeper strategy behind castle design: redundancy, because medieval engineers assumed something would fail, a gate burned, a wall breached, a tower overrun, so they built secondary lines, inner baileys and elevated keeps that reset the battle again and again, forcing attackers to relive the same deadly process multiple times, while fatigue multiplied and morale drained. And towers played another crucial role rarely shown in films: they controlled communication with the outside world, signaling allies, nearby towns or relief forces through fire beacons and flags, turning turning isolated stone into a node in a regional defense network, which meant besiegers never knew how long they truly had before another army appeared on the horizon. And uncertainty is a silent killer of confidence, and the final twist is that towers were symbols as much as weapons, rising above walls not just to see farther but to project dominance, because height equals authority in the human mind, and every time an attacker looked up at defenders standing calm against the sky, they felt smaller, slower, and more exposed, while the defenders felt elevated not only physically but emotionally. And in siege warfare, that emotional altitude often decided endurance, because the side that believes it holds the high ground mentally will outlast the one forced to stare upward, waiting for gravity, arrows, and time to do their work. When brute force failed, attackers turned to patience, and that is when castles revealed their most ruthless design principle. They were built to survive being surrounded by the end of the world, because a siege was not just a military maneuver, it was an attempt to suffocate an entire community into surrender, and everything inside the walls was engineered with that slow strangulation in mind, starting underground where the most important defensive structure was often invisible, the well carved deep into stone so water flowed even if every river outside was poisoned, diverted, or guarded by the enemy, because thirst breaks resistance faster than fear, and castles that lacked secure water rarely lasted long, which meant engineers treated wells like lifelines drilled straight into survival itself. Next came food storage, not random piles of grain but controlled reserves rotated carefully to prevent rot, guarded from pests, sometimes sealed in stone granaries raised above ground level to avoid dampness, because defenders understood the real clock of a siege ticked inside stomachs, not on battlefields. And here is the twist: castles often stored more food than comfort allowed, packing courtyards with livestock, turning halls into supply rooms, cramming spaces designed for daily life into tight survival mode, because defense meant accepting discomfort early to avoid catastrophe later. And while attackers outside struggled to maintain supply lines stretched across hostile territory, defenders rationed, deliberately measuring grain, watering ale, stretching resources with discipline enforced by authority and sometimes fear, because hunger inside the walls could turn citizens into enemies faster than any invading army. And this internal pressure created another hidden battlefield: morale management, where leaders had to keep hope alive through routine, religion, and visible control, organizing watches, repairs, and even small ceremonies to give structure to waiting, because idle time breeds panic, and panic collapses order. And castles were designed not just as physical shields but as psychological containers that kept fear from spreading uncontrollably. Meanwhile, attackers tried to speed up surrender through intimidation, building siege camps in clear view, launching bombardments not always to breach walls but to remind defenders that danger never slept. And this constant tension was meant to erode nerves, but castles countered with elevation and enclosure, because thick walls muffled distant chaos. Towers provided perspective, and daily routines inside created the illusion of stability, even as the world outside narrowed to a ring of enemies. And when bombardment intensified, walls absorbed shock through thickness and layered construction, sometimes filled with rubble that dispersed impact rather than cracking cleanly, meaning damage took time to become catastrophic, and time again favored defenders. Then there were hidden postern gates, small concealed doors allowing messengers to slip out at night to call for help or bring in supplies, turning the siege into a leaky blockade where total isolation was harder than attackers expected. And every successful secret sortie shattered the illusion of control outside the walls, because it proved the defenders were not truly trapped, merely contained. And that distinction crushed the morale of besiegers, who realized their grip was not as tight as it seemed. And all of this leads to an uncomfortable realization: a castle under siege functioned less like a fortress and more like a pressure chamber designed to withstand external force while regulating internal stress, balancing food, water, discipline, and hope with brutal precision. And the longer it held, the more the psychological tide turned, because an army forced to wait while a target refused to break begins to doubt not the enemy's strength but its own purpose. And once that doubt spreads through the ranks, even the strongest siege lines start to feel like cages built for the attackers themselves. When walls could not be climbed and gates would not fall, attackers went underground, and that is when castle defense turned into a battle you could hear but not see, because mining, digging tunnels to collapse walls from below became one of the most terrifying threats a fortress could face. And defenders responded with a countermeasure so tense it felt like listening for your own heartbeat in the dark. Countermining, where soldiers and laborers pressed ears to the ground, bowls of water trembling beside them, searching for faint vibrations that meant the enemy was clawing through earth beneath their feet. And the moment digging was detected, the defense shifted below the surface. Shafts dug downward, tunnels carved outward, creating a hidden maze where underground ambushes erupted in suffocating darkness lit only by torches and fear. And when opposing tunnels met, the fight was brutal and close. Smoke pumped into passages, fires set to collapse supports hand-to-hand clashes in spaces too tight to swing properly, and here the castle proved it defended not just its height but its depth, turning even the soil into contested ground above. Engineers reinforced vulnerable sections with thicker bases and angled stone foundations to resist undermining, because castles evolved in response to every new trick attackers invented, and when tunneling failed, besiegers rolled forward siege towers, massive wooden structures meant to rise to wall height and deliver soldiers directly onto the battlements. But castles answered with fire, because wood is brave until it burns, and defenders launched flaming arrows, hurled pitch and dropped burning material, turning towers into towering torches that lit the battlefield at night, while morale inside the attacking ranks went up in smoke with them if battering rams approached. Gates were reinforced with iron bands backed by secondary doors and protected by murder holes that turned the space above a ram into a vertical execution zone. And even when artillery entered medieval warfare in the form of trebuchets and early cannons, castles adapted again, thickening walls, lowering profiles and adding angled earthworks to absorb impacts, because defense was never static, it was a constant arms race carved in stone. And this reveals a powerful truth: castles survived not because they were perfect but because they were flexible within limits, modified, expanded and repaired across generations, each scar from a past siege becoming a lesson embedded in future defenses. And throughout all of this, defenders exploited another invisible advantage: interior mobility. Narrow passages, stairways and wall walks allowed them to shift forces quickly to threaten points, while attackers outside had to move across open ground under fire, meaning response time favored defenders again and again. And when attackers finally did breach a wall section, they discovered the fight was just beginning, because rubble created steep, unstable slopes that slowed advances, while defenders above targeted the choke point. Inner barricades sprang up behind the breach, turning a single success into another layered struggle. And this is where exhaustion peaked. Attackers expected victory at the first breakthrough, but castles were built to deny that emotional release, replacing triumph with another climb, another choke point, another storm of projectiles. And that repeated shattering of expectations drained morale more effectively than losses alone. And in the end, every offensive innovation met a defensive answer, not always perfect, not always successful, but enough to stretch the timeline of conquest until the question shifted from can we take this castle to how much longer can we afford to try. And once that question entered the minds of commanders, the castle had already done what it was built to do: turned strength into doubt, momentum into delay, and ambition into a slow grinding calculation no army enjoyed making. By the time an enemy reached the inner ward, the castle had already stripped away speed, numbers and confidence, leaving only exhaustion and desperation. And that was exactly where the final defensive design took over, because inner baileys were not just backup spaces, they were controlled kill zones where defenders could retreat in order without losing dominance, pulling attackers deeper into tighter areas overlooked from higher walls, windows and towers, turning pursuit into exposure. And here elevation stacked again, because every inner structure rose above the last like steps in a stone funnel, forcing attackers to climb while defenders descended with gravity and momentum on their side. The architecture guided movement whether invaders understood it or not: corridors, narrowing turns, bending sightlines, doors positioned at angles that prevented a straight rush, every corner designed to slow, split or compress a force that had already spent hours or days fighting just to get this far. Then there was the keep, the heart of last resistance, often mistaken for a royal residence when in truth it was a fortress within a fortress, built with the thickest walls, the highest vantage point and entrances raised above ground level so ladders could be pulled up and stairways destroyed if retreat became necessary. Once defenders withdrew into the keep, the siege effectively reset on a smaller scale, fewer entrances to guard, shorter wall lines to hold attackers forced into even narrower approaches, where numbers lost meaning again. Inside the keep, supplies were stored not as luxury but as insurance: water cisterns, food reserves and protected living quarters designed to survive isolation after the outer castle fell, because medieval engineers understood the psychology of layered hope. As long as there was another defensible point, morale could survive, and morale often mattered more than manpower. At this stage, the keep also served as a command center, giving leaders height for visibility and control, allowing signals to continue even when lower sections were lost, preventing the collapse attackers desperately tried to trigger. Throughout all of this, verticality remained the ultimate advantage, because climbing while under attack drains energy at terrifying speed, and defenders moving downhill strike with more force, more balance and less fatigue. That imbalance multiplied in stairwells where narrow spirals turned group assaults into single file struggles, each attacker facing a defender who had room to swing while they did not. If a staircase fell trapdoors, barricades and internal choke points slowed progress again, and this reveals the brutal truth of castle defense. It was never about one dramatic last stand, it was about a chain of controlled withdrawals, each step planned, each layer bought with time, each fallback position stronger than the last relative to the shrinking number of defenders remaining. Attackers already drained from breaching walls and surviving outer kill zones found themselves facing fresh resistance in spaces designed for defense, not assault, and that constant denial of momentum crushed morale more than casualties did, because hope of quick victory died room by room, staircase by staircase, and at the highest point of the keep banners still flew as long as resistance remained visible, proof the castle was not yet taken, that sight alone could hold defenders together through fear and fatigue, while attackers below felt the weight of height pressing down again. And when you zoom out, the entire castle reveals its final secret. It was built like a coiled spring, compressing space as attackers advanced, storing defensive advantage in height, thickness and control of movement, so that the closer the enemy got to the center, the stronger the defense became relative to the shrinking number of defenders. And that inversion of expectations is what made medieval castles psychologically devastating to assault, because victory did not feel closer with progress, it felt more distant, more costly and more uncertain with every step forward. In the end, the greatest defense of a medieval castle was not a wall, a tower or a weapon, but a simple crushing equation every commander understood: too late time multiplied by resistance equals collapse. And castles were built to stretch that equation until even victory tasted like defeat, because every extra day outside the walls meant more food consumed, more horses dying, more soldiers sick, more discipline cracking. And meanwhile inside the fortress, routines held, water flowed, banners flew, and that contrast slowly poisoned the attackers' will. This is why so many sieges ended not with heroic final assaults, but with negotiations, withdrawals, betrayals or relief armies appearing at the worst possible moment, because castles were anchors in the landscape that bought time for politics, alliances and reinforcements to move, and their true power was strategic, not cinematic, forcing enemies to commit months to a single objective while the wider war shifted elsewhere. And when gunpowder began to change warfare, castles did not vanish overnight, they adapted, lowering walls, thickening bases, adding angled earthworks, proving again that fortification was an evolving conversation between attack and defense rather than a static relic of the past. And looking back, what makes medieval castles so fascinating is not that they were unbeatable, because many fell, but that they turned war into a test of endurance where psychology, logistics and engineering mattered as much as courage. And the final twist is almost ironic: castles protected people by trapping them, saved lives by restricting freedom, and won wars by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. That paradox sits at the heart of every stone tower still standing today, silent proof that survival often belongs not to the strongest blow, but to the side that can hold out longer under pressure. Once you understand that every narrow window, every steep stair, every layered wall stops looking like architecture and starts looking like a decision made by someone who knew exactly how desperate, patient and relentless human beings could be when everything was on the line, which leaves one haunting realization: castles were not monuments to power, they were monuments to fear, built by people who expected the worst and prepared so thoroughly that even centuries later their defenses still make us feel small, exposed and aware that stone, time and human ingenuity once combined to create places where entire armies could break themselves against silence.